So then let's start. Hello, my name is Dagmar Frank from WTW Women in Finance, and I have the honor to invite you to participate today at the important initiative Women Against Corruption, WAC. We invite speakers to inform us about organized crime, money laundering, and corruption. And what does it mean to women? Now, my dear colleague, Katharine Esmeyer, will introduce and welcome our outstanding guest tonight. Katharina, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I have the pleasure to introduce our wonderful and inspiring speaker tonight, Anne Basham from the United States. She's the founding chair of the Taskforce on Human Trafficking for the Parliamentary Intelligence Security Forum. This means that she leads a coalition of members of parliament and government leaders from around the world in discussions about effectively combating human trafficking globally. Her focus in her work has always been on human rights issues. She told me that her heart is especially with human trafficking, violence against women, child welfare, criminal justice, and education. And during her service in senior leadership at the Department of Justice, the Office for Victims of Crime, she developed strategies to help nonprofit organizations serving victims of human trafficking, terrorism, sexual assault, and child welfare. Additionally, Anne is the former CEO of the anti-trafficking organization ATI and the founder and the CEO of Ascent Consulting. So I want to thank you, Anne, for joining us tonight. You're doing incredibly important work, and I'm very honored to have you here and that we are all able to listen to your insights. So thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for this great forum and opportunity to talk about this and for your interest in this. And thank you to all of you listening and your interest in really combating human trafficking. So before I dive into the intersection between corruption, anti-money laundering, and human trafficking, I really want to give you a real life story of what human trafficking actually looks like. So there's a girl named Layla. This is a true story. I've changed her name. She's a 12-year-old girl, a Yazidi girl in Iraq. In 2014, when ISIS terrorists attacked her village, like thousands of girls, she was rounded up with her family, and women and girls and men and boys were all separated. She was actually taken to an underground facility with approximately 50 other girls, where she was then sold for sex repeatedly throughout the day. She actually never saw the light of day for several years. And when her health conditions deteriorated to such a point that she was considered no longer useful to ISIS, they actually returned her to her family for ransom. And they used the profits, the funds from selling Layla repeatedly. Those profits were used to actually fund ISIS terrorist operations. And this is something that most people don't realize, is that human trafficking is not only a humanitarian crisis, but it affects the stability of the entire world, not just the Middle East, but it is used to fund terrorist organizations and criminal activities all around the world. It is actually used as a form of funding and illicit finance for them. So it's very, very important to discuss this and often overlooked. Layla is an example, honestly, not only of human trafficking, but of modern day slavery. So just to put it in terms for you, modern day slavery occurs when a human being is treated not as a person, but as a commodity that can be sold and then just discarded when they're no longer useful. The actual definition I'm going to read for you is actually compelling a person through force, fraud, or coercion to engage in sex or labor. So it's not just sex trafficking, it's labor trafficking as well. And it also includes forced marriage, which we're going to talk a little bit about as well. This generates the US equivalent, and this is a large number, of $150 billion annually worldwide for traffickers. So human traffickers make $150 billion annually, US dollars, on trafficking, the equivalent. And the International Labor Organization, the ILO, they estimate that there are currently approximately 40 million, actually over 40 million people enslaved or victims of trafficking all around the world. There actually are more slaves on the planet today than at any other time in history. From my perspective, this is not only the second largest criminal enterprise in the world, human trafficking. Drug trafficking is actually number one, but it is also the largest humanitarian crisis of our time, truly. There are many people who actually believe it has surpassed the numbers of drug trafficking, but we just don't have, we don't have accurate reporting measures and data yet to support all of that. There is some good news I'm going to get into a little bit more later, but there's some good news. In December of 2021, actually your country, Germany, you may have seen news reports that the first ISIS member was officially convicted for crimes against the Yazidis. The woman I spoke of, Layla, that little girl, she was a Yazidi, and war crimes, actually, Germany was the first. An ISIS member was found guilty of not only genocide, but of human trafficking. And Germany should be applauded for this. It's one of few countries that have actually pursued prosecution against ISIS members for their crimes against the Yazidis. So there is some good news. So what is really fueling this epidemic? Well, this is why I'm here today, because at the core is greed and corruption. Unlike drugs or weapons, a person can be sold over and over again. In fact, when human beings are viewed as a product, there's really no end to how often they can be sold until they basically are in such poor health that they're no longer considered useful. They really are just considered a product. When most people, however, think of human trafficking, they think of kidnapping. However, in the United States and other nations, including Germany, actually many other countries, most often human trafficking occurs through the process of manipulation and grooming, and it's not kidnapping. Now, for the Yazidis, and for that story that I told you in the Middle East, that was kidnapping, but for most instances, that is not how it happens in countries like Germany and in countries like the United States. In fact, in the United States alone, 1 in 5 children will be approached by a trafficker at some point in their lifetime, one in 5. And what this says to me really is that human trafficking is not an issue that is resolved by poverty. Certain crimes we link to economic hardship. If there's a place of economic hardship or poverty, then perhaps that crime will increase. Well, that's actually not the case with human trafficking. Human trafficking does not discriminate. It thrives in places where there is wealth. And so really poverty and human trafficking, they are not exclusive. And so addressing that topic doesn't always tackle the topic of human trafficking. Like victims, traffickers come from all parts of society. They come from every race, every gender, every socioeconomic group, like I've said. And what I really want to share with you today, because I know it's women on this call, and a lot of you are mothers, aunts, sisters, you are caregivers, grandparents, and I really want to explain to you what a trafficker looks like and what the signs of grooming look like. So first of all, traffickers often pose as a boyfriend or a girlfriend. A common type is actually a very polished man or woman in their early 20s who pretends to be a girlfriend or a boyfriend to the teen. Most victims of trafficking are between the ages not most, but the prime target age is between 12 and 14 years old. So very, very young. That is considered the prime target age that they target. Then systematically over time, the victim's trust is actually gained through gifts and flattery. And eventually the victim is threatened or manipulated by threats of harm to themselves or their families into sexual encounters, basically for profit with the trafficker. Traffickers also look like organized criminal networks. They can operate through gangs. Gangs frequently use victims of trafficking as a source of income. To them, it's a commodity and it's a way to make money. They can traffic drugs and they can traffic people. Traffickers can also pose oftentimes, and this is especially true on the continent of Africa or other nations, as false employers. They lure victims in with promises of jobs and say, if you come with me, if you go to this country, then you will prosper. And when they get there, their passport is seized from them and they actually are trafficked, and very few of them are ever able to escape or even make contact with their family again. And finally, oftentimes, this is one that people don't think about. They're lured away by the statement, you could be a model. So a lot of modeling is actually, a front for luring in, teen girls through flattery, saying you can be a model, but in reality, it's really for very sinister purposes. And finally, victims can honestly be lured in by their own parents. It's called familial trafficking. Unfortunately, we're going to talk about that too in just a bit with child marriage, but there are many instances of familial trafficking. This one is more economically based. It usually happens because parents, mothers need money for food or rent sometimes. Sometimes it's for a drug habit, but it's especially heartbreaking. So who do traffickers target? This is really important. So they target young people, like I said, the typical age is between 12 and 14, but it doesn't have to be that young. It definitely can be, young women over the age of 18, but it's those who really are especially vulnerable. They lack a sense of belonging. They really are willing to keep secrets, including in their relationships. They don't have a good relationship with their parents oftentimes. Sometimes it's just kids who are bored, or they're really looking for a boyfriend. I really want a boyfriend, and a trafficker sees that and wants to target them. They spend frequent time away from friends and family. And sometimes, and this to me is perhaps the saddest of all, it's those with pre-existing physical, emotional, or cognitive disabilities. Actually, those with disabilities are the largest minority population on the planet, and they are one of the most targeted by traffickers as well because of those very vulnerabilities. So to dive into one of the most infrequently discussed types of trafficking, and one that actually we're seeing more and more of in Europe, and you're probably hearing a little bit more about, is forced marriage. So this is a form of modern day slavery. This is actually included in that number of 40 million. And it has recently come to the forefront because of the crisis in Afghanistan to an extent. The sudden economic upheaval has resulted in more young girls than ever being sold as, quote, brides. And we're talking very, very young girls. And it's truly heartbreaking. Girls are sold by their parents often in order, honestly, just to make ends meet. Some of them are as young as 8 years old. The economic collapse before the Taliban's takeover in August of this year has already forced many poor families to make some incredibly difficult choices. According to UNICEF, before the COVID-19 pandemic, more than 100 million girls in the next 10 years are expected to marry before their 18th birthday. So UNICEF has reported that they expect an increase of more than 100 million girls in the next 10 years. To marry before their 18th birthday. And this, they said, is likely to increase by 10 million as a result of the pandemic. So it's likely to increase by 10% just because of the pandemic and because of the economic strain that has been put on so many families. According to the World Bank, ending the practice of child marriage would save billions of dollars annually, resulting in a savings of $4 trillion by 2030. So really, to state this plainly, the world cannot afford to allow child marriage, forced marriage, human trafficking to continue. The economic reasons alone are a compelling reason to place a priority on this critical intersection and really eradicating human trafficking and stopping it, because it truly can be stopped. So I know this is heavy. The statistics are incredibly, incredibly grim, but I truly do believe that there is a solution for almost everything, and human trafficking is no exception. I previously worked on human trafficking, as they said, and violence against women at the Department of Justice here in Washington, D.C. And I saw firsthand something I like to say is a cycle of rescue, restore, repeat. And basically it was, let's rescue a victim, let's restore them. And unfortunately, they often ended right back up in that cycle because they really needed a viable job. I've talked to survivors of human trafficking from around the world, and I've heard their stories, and I have some solutions on how we can do this. And the first is exactly why your group is here today. It's really follow the money. So when it comes to dismantling terrorist cells or warlords around the globe, how do terrorists fund their operations? That's what we really have to look at. Well, frequently they fund it through kidnapping and human trafficking. As I stated earlier, human trafficking is one of the primary financial sources for Boko Haram and ISIS. They also sell them as child brides later, and so these women are further trapped because they have children. They're now in forced marriages, and it's very, very difficult to leave. Terrorists also recruit vulnerable girls through deception and false promises. For example, in 2015, ISIS recruited a 15-year-old girl from a school in Western Europe. She had been pretending to be in a romantic relationship with, She had been pretending to be in a romantic relationship with her on Facebook. She had excellent grades. She kind of had an idyllic life, but she really saw these images. There was advertising that she had found online, and she saw these idyllic images of families walking through the park together in Syria. And, you know, she's young and vulnerable, and she was really groomed online through this advertising. She left her home in 2016. She actually traveled to Syria, to Iraq, to marry a member of ISIS because the advertising looked like it was just this great, wonderful family. This, unfortunately, is a typical scenario, and women and girls find themselves in these situations where they think they're originally agreeing to a marriage, and in actuality, what they're agreeing to is domestic servitude and slavery, and then they can never get out. They thought they're getting one thing, and they're actually getting another. So what can be done about this? Well, one thing is the same thing that governments do when they dismantle instigators of war and mass violence, and that's really, like I said, follow the money. So here in the United States, we actually have an incredible mechanism called global Magnitsky sanctions. Some of you may have heard of that. With Magnitsky sanctions, the US can target warlords and terrorist leaders and really render them powerless by cutting off their supply of funding through large and small channels. The UK actually and several other nations have a version of this Magnitsky style sanctions. The UK, I think, calls theirs the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2018. And then I know actually, I believe in Germany in 2020, or no, the EU in 2020, passed something similar in December of 2020. They passed their own version of Magnitsky style sanctions. Not quite as many teeth, as we like to say, as the US version, but it was a start. And that, I believe, was in December of 2020. So if the government leaders really targeted stopping and rescuing and stopping this flow of human trafficking and victims of terrorist operations, it really would be akin to targeted sanctions, which is what Magnitsky sanctions are. I mean, if we really went after traffickers and trafficking victims, we would be cutting off a huge source of their income and meanwhile saving lives. So if we placed a significant amount of efforts on stopping the flow of girls and boys into the hands of Boko Haram and ISIS, they would lose a significant portion of their income. So currently, according to the United Nations, 1 in 3 women are affected by gender-based violence, and this number actually skyrockets 200% in high conflict war zones where terrorist cell thrives. There are over 2,800 women and children estimated to be experiencing ongoing sexual abuse by ISIS in captivity alone. So one of the other things that we can do to really address this is to educate the financial sector. So human trafficking intersects with, quite frankly, an infinite number of sectors, and eradicating it across the globe will reap even more rewards than the ones I've mentioned. But one of the biggest ways that we can do this is, what if we took a portion, just a fraction that we invested into really educating those who are in the financial sector, those who are going to see those little transactions going through and really recognize the red flags that we see there. That would be one of the most important things that we actually could do. So one of the biggest ways that this happens is that once traffickers have their money, the money laundering tactics that they use are, they want to move the money quickly. So they want to move it anonymously, they want to move it quickly, they want to move it across large geographic areas. And they do this through what we call interstate funnel account activity. So interstate funnel account activity. And in the United States, so I'm speaking from a US perspective, and it's not that different overseas as well. Funnel account activity is where an associate of a criminal organization, they make a series of small deposits, all under $10,000, which are not subject to reporting requirements. So they go unnoticed. They're not big exchanges, they're just small. And then the cash is withdrawn, and then it's taken to another state here in the US by a different associate with the same criminal network. And then these funnel accounts, what they do is they allow them to exploit the US financial system or financial system in any country, because they can move the money quickly, they move it in small amounts, and it's done very cheaply across great distances. And because of this, financial institutions, they are actually on the front lines of the war against human trafficking. Financial institution employees are among those most likely to see and to report suspicious account activity. And they are often the first step in helping to rescue individuals from human trafficking. So I'm about to wrap up here. I want to give you all time to ask questions, but several major banks have actually taken some steps towards this. They've enhanced their internal controls to disrupt the criminal organization's ability to really employ interstate funnel accounts and to move their proceeds. But there is still so much more that can do. My real challenge to financial institutions is to place a priority on really what I like to call red flag training. So really training their employees, a lot of those mid-level employees, to really recognize what they're seeing, what's going on, and to be on the lookout to report what could be a suspicious transaction. So, and some of this. So in conclusion, if we really want to stop the epidemic of modern day slavery, we need to defensively stop the flow of illicit funding for human trafficking. And then offensively, we need to dedicate money to preventing human trafficking really through education to the financial sector and to children as well. So this two-pronged approach, it requires a lot of collaboration. It requires public-private partnerships between governments and NGOs and those in the financial sector, and the communities for being the eyes and ears as well. But it's not something we can't tackle. So I know I've given a lot of information, and it's a lot to digest, but that really wraps up the bulk of my remarks for today.